In the shadowed heart of London, where gaslight flickers and whispers of scandal haunt every drawing room, a young woman named Alara lives as a ghost in her own home. For a decade since her father's untimely death, her stepmother, the formidable Baroness Ashworth, has relentlessly chipped away at her spirit, leaving her to believe she is worth less than the dust motes dancing in the gloom. But destiny, a force as powerful as the tide, is about to shift. The arrival of the enigmatic and devastatingly handsome Duke of Blackwood, a man every debutante desires and every mother schemes for, will shatter the suffocating silence of Alara's world. His gaze, as piercing as a winter frost, will see past the shadows to the fire hidden within her, igniting a chain of events that will unravel a dark tapestry of secrets, betrayal, and a love as fierce and untamed as the Cornish cliffs. Ashworth Manor, a relic of a grander age, stood grim and imposing against the perpetually gray London sky. Its stone facade, stained with the tears of 1,000 rains, seemed to weep for the vibrant life that had once filled its halls. For Alara, it was not a home, but a beautifully crafted cage. Her days were a monotonous cycle of servitude, orchestrated by her stepmother, Baroness Ashworth. The Baroness, a woman whose beauty was as sharp and cold as a shard of glass, had married Alara's father, the late Baron Ashworth, for his title and fortune, and upon his death had inherited both, along with a stepdaughter she viewed as little more than a nuisance. Alara's world was confined to the dusty attics, the cavernous kitchens, and the forgotten corners of the sprawling estate. Her only companions were the worn, leather-bound books in the library, her father's last remaining legacy, and the silent portraits of her ancestors whose painted eyes seemed to follow her with a mixture of pity and encouragement. The Baroness had made it her mission to extinguish every spark of defiance in Alara, to mold her into a timid, obedient creature, invisible to the glittering society that the Baroness so desperately craved to conquer. Alara, the Baroness's voice, as cutting as a winter wind, would echo through the grand staircase. "The silver needs polishing, and see that you use the new polish. I will not have the Duke of Blackwood dining with tarnished spoons." The Duke of Blackwood. The name was a constant refrain in the Baroness's mouth, a symbol of her ambition. He was the most eligible bachelor in all of England, a man of immense wealth, power, and a reputation as dark and intriguing as his title. The Baroness, with her own daughter, the vapid but beautiful Clara, to marry off, had set her sights on the Duke. An invitation to his annual ball was the most coveted prize of the season, and the Baroness had, through sheer will and cunning, secured one. Alara, of course, was not to attend. She was to remain behind, a silent cog in the machinery of the household, ensuring that everything was perfect for Clara's grand debut. As she meticulously polished a silver ladle, its surface reflecting her own pale, weary face, she allowed herself a fleeting moment of fantasy. She imagined herself in a gown of midnight blue silk, waltzing under the glittering chandeliers of the Duke's ballroom, her heart light and her spirit free. But reality, as it always did, came crashing back in the form of Clara's petulant voice. "Alara, you've been dawdling for an hour. Mama says I am to have a new gown for the ball, and you are to help the seamstress. And do try not to look so morose. It's terribly draining." Alara, with a quiet sigh, put down the ladle and followed her stepsister, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. The seamstress, a kindly woman named Mrs. Gable, always treated Alara with a gentle compassion that was a balm to her wounded soul. While Clara preened and posed, demanding more lace and a lower neckline, Alara would sit quietly in the corner, her nimble fingers expertly threading needles and stitching delicate seams. It was during one of these fittings that a small, intricately carved wooden bird fell from the pocket of Alara's worn dress. It was a gift from her father, one of the few tangible memories she had of him. Clara, with a cruel laugh, snatched it up. "What is this dreadful little thing?" she sneered, her fingers closing around the delicate carving. "Please, Clara, give it back," Alara pleaded, her voice barely a whisper. "It was my father's." "Your father?" Clara's eyes, the same cold blue as her mother's, narrowed. "He was my father too for a time, but he had the poor taste to die and leave us with you." With a flick of her wrist, she tossed the bird into the crackling fireplace. A strangled cry escaped Alara's lips as she watched the flames consume the last piece of her father she had. In that moment, something within her, Something long dormant began to stir. It was a flicker of anger, a spark of defiance that even the Baroness's relentless cruelty had not been able to completely extinguish. That evening, as she lay in her small, cold bed in the attic, the smell of smoke still clinging to her clothes, Elara made a silent vow. She would not let them break her. She would find a way to escape this gilded cage, to reclaim the life that had been stolen from her. And as the city lights began to twinkle in the distance, she thought of the Duke of Blackwood, not as a prize to be won, but as a symbol of a world she was determined to one day enter, a world where she would be more than just a shadow in the corner. The night of the Blackwood ball arrived, cloaked in a swirl of anticipation and the scent of expensive perfume. Ashworth Manor was a hive of frantic activity. The Baroness, a formidable figure in emerald green silk, barked orders at the servants, her voice a sharp counterpoint to Clara's excited chatter. Elara, dressed in her plain gray frock, moved through the chaos like a phantom, her presence acknowledged only when a task needed doing. She helped Clara into her gown, a confection of cream-colored lace and satin that had cost a small fortune. She arranged her stepsister's golden curls into an elaborate coiffure, her own reflection in the vanity mirror, a stark contrast. A pale face, large, expressive gray eyes, and a cascade of dark hair pulled back in a simple braid. As she placed a string of pearls around Clara's neck, their gazes met in the mirror. For a fleeting moment, Elara saw a flicker of something in Clara's eyes. Not pity, but a strange, unsettling envy. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the usual haughty disdain. "Do try not to smudge my powder, Elara," Clara said, her voice laced with impatience. "I must look my best for the Duke." Once the Baroness and Clara had departed in their grand carriage, a heavy silence descended upon the manor. Elara, left to her own devices, felt a familiar wave of loneliness wash over her. But tonight, something was different. The embers of defiance that had been kindled in her heart were still glowing. She would not spend this night locked away in the attic, weeping over a lost trinket. She made her way to the library, her sanctuary. The room was dark, save for the sliver of moonlight filtering through the tall, arched windows. She ran her fingers along the spines of the books, their familiar scent a comfort to her soul. It was here, amongst the stories of brave heroines and dashing heroes, that she felt a sense of belonging. It was in her father's favorite armchair that she found it, a small, leather-bound journal tucked away in a hidden compartment. His handwriting, elegant and flowing, filled the pages. It was a diary, a record of his life, his hopes, his dreams. And as Elara began to read, a story unfolded that she had never known, a story that would change the course of her life forever. He wrote of his first wife, Elara's mother, a woman of gentle spirit and artistic talent. He wrote of his love for her, a love that was as deep and abiding as the ocean. And then he wrote of her sudden, tragic death, a fever that had swept through London and taken her from him. He wrote of his grief, a grief so profound that it had left him vulnerable to the charms of the Baroness, then a beautiful and seemingly compassionate widow. But as Elara turned the pages, a darker narrative emerged. Her father wrote of the Baroness's true nature, her cold heart and her insatiable ambition. He wrote of his growing fear for his daughter, of his regret at having brought such a woman into their lives. And then in the final entry, dated just days before his own death, he wrote something that made Elara's blood run cold. "I fear I have made a terrible mistake. The Baroness, she is not what she seems. I have discovered something, a secret, a deception so profound that it threatens to destroy everything I hold dear. I have made arrangements to protect Elara, to ensure that she will one day know the truth. The key is with Mr. Alistair Finch, my solicitor. He is a good man, a man I trust. He will know what to do." Alistair Finch. The name resonated in Elara's memory. He was an old friend of her father's, a man she hadn't seen since the funeral. A sudden, daring plan began to form in her mind. She would find Mr. Finch. She would uncover the truth. But how? The Baroness kept a close watch on her every move. She was a prisoner in her own home. Then her eyes fell upon a small, intricate key that had been tucked into the pages of the journal. A key to what? She didn't know, but it was a start. With renewed purpose, Ilara made her way to her father's old study, a room that had been kept locked since his death. The key from the journal fit perfectly into the lock. The door swung open, revealing a room shrouded in dust and memories. On his desk, amongst a pile of forgotten papers, was a letter addressed to her. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. It was from her father. He wrote of his love for her, of his regret for not being able to protect her. And then he revealed the truth. The baroness had not been a widow when he met her. Her husband, a wealthy merchant, had died under mysterious circumstances, leaving her with a considerable fortune, a fortune that she had used to insinuate herself into London society, a fortune that she had used to ensnare Ilara's father. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. Her father had discovered that the baroness had a secret so scandalous that it could ruin her. The baroness had another daughter, an illegitimate child that she had given up at birth, a child that she had long believed to be dead. But she was not dead. She was alive, and her name was Ilara. Ilara stared at the words, her mind reeling. She was not the daughter of Baron Ashworth. She was the illegitimate child of the woman who had made her life a living hell. The woman who had treated her with such cruelty, such disdain. It was a truth so monstrous, so unbelievable, that for a moment she thought she might be dreaming. But the letter in her hand was real. The words on the page were real. And as the full weight of the revelation settled upon her, a new feeling began to take root in her heart. A feeling that was stronger than anger, stronger than despair. It was a feeling of determination. She would not be a victim. She would not be a pawn in the baroness's twisted game. She would use this truth, this terrible, earth-shattering truth, to reclaim her life, to reclaim her identity. And as the first rays of dawn began to break over the London skyline, Ilara knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that her life was about to change. And it would all begin with the Duke of Blackwood. She would go to the ball, she would find a way, and she would make the baroness pay for her sins. The Duke of Blackwood, Alistair Beaumont, stood on the balcony of his grand ballroom, a solitary figure amidst the swirling sea of London's elite. From his vantage point, he could see them all, the hopeful debutantes, their eyes shining with a mixture of awe and ambition, the matchmaking mamas, their whispers as sharp as their diamond earrings, the preening young lords, their conversation a tedious litany of horses and gambling debts. He was the center of their universe, the sun around which they all revolved, and he was utterly, profoundly bored. Alistair was a man who had everything. A title that stretched back for centuries, a fortune that could rival the crowns, and a face that could make even the most jaded of society matrons swoon. But behind the carefully constructed facade of the brooding, enigmatic Duke was a man haunted by a past he could not escape. He had seen the worst of humanity, had witnessed firsthand the corrupting influence of power and greed. And it had left him with a deep-seated cynicism, a weariness that clung to him like a shroud. He had returned to London at the behest of his aging mother, the Dowager Duchess, who was determined to see him married and settled. And so, he played the part, hosting lavish balls and enduring the endless parade of simpering debutantes. But his heart remained untouched, his emotions locked away in a vault as impenetrable as the one that held his family's jewels. His gaze swept across the ballroom, a sea of pastel silks and glittering diamonds. And then he saw her. She was standing near the French doors that led to the garden, a vision in a simple midnight blue gown that seemed to absorb the light around her. Her dark hair was styled in a simple chignon, adorned with a single white camellia. She was not a conventional beauty, not in the way that Clara Ashworth was, with her golden curls and doll-like features. But there was something about her, a quiet intensity in her gray eyes, a graceful elegance in her posture, that drew him in. She was not like the other women in the room. She was not vying for his attention, not trying to catch his eye. She was simply there, a still point in a turning world. And in that moment, Alistair felt a flicker of something he had not felt in a very long time: curiosity. He made his way through the throng of guests, his progress marked by a trail of fluttering fans and hushed whispers. As he approached her, he saw that she was not alone. She was talking to a young man, a handsome but rather foppish lord whose name escaped him. The lord was clearly trying to charm her, but she seemed immune to his flattery, her expression polite but distant. "Lord Harrington," Alistair said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that cut through the chatter. "I trust you are enjoying the evening." Lord Harrington, startled by the Duke's sudden appearance, stammered a reply, his face flushing a rather unbecoming shade of red. Alistair, with a curt nod, dismissed him, his gaze never leaving the woman in the blue gown. "And you, miss?" he began, his voice softening slightly. "Ashworth," she replied, her voice a soft, melodic whisper. "Elara Ashworth." "Miss Ashworth," he repeated, the name a strange and beautiful sound on his lips. "I do not believe we have had the pleasure of being introduced." "No, Your Grace," she said, her gaze meeting his without a trace of the coy flirtatiousness he was so accustomed to. "We have not." There was a challenge in her eyes, a spark of defiance that he found both intriguing and strangely alluring. He was used to women who fawned over him, who hung on his every word. But this woman, this Elara Ashworth, she was different. She was a mystery, a puzzle that he suddenly found himself desperate to solve. "Then allow me to rectify that oversight," he said, a slow, charming smile spreading across his face. "Duke of Blackwood, at your service." He took her hand, his gloved fingers brushing against hers, and for a moment the world seemed to fade away. There was only the two of them, standing in a bubble of silence amidst the cacophony of the ballroom. He led her to the dance floor, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. As they moved to the strains of the waltz, he found himself captivated by her. She was a natural dancer, her movements fluid and graceful. But it was her conversation that truly intrigued him. She was intelligent, well-read, and possessed a quick wit that kept him on his toes. She spoke of books and art, of politics and philosophy, her eyes shining with an intelligence that he found both refreshing and incredibly attractive. She did not once mention his title, his wealth, or his status. She spoke to him as if he were just a man, not a duke. And in that moment, Alistair Beaumont, the jaded and cynical Duke of Blackwood, felt something shift within him. It was a feeling he had long thought himself incapable of, a feeling that was as terrifying as it was exhilarating. He was falling for her, and as the last notes of the waltz faded away, he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his soul that he would not let her go. He would uncover the secrets that lay hidden behind those beautiful, sad eyes. He would be the one to break down the wall she had built around her heart, and he would make her his. But as he looked across the ballroom, his gaze fell upon the Baroness Ashworth, her eyes fixed on them with an expression of pure, unadulterated fury. And in that moment, Alistair knew that winning Elara's heart would not be an easy task. It would be a battle against a woman who would stop at nothing to get what she wanted, a battle he was more than willing to fight. For in Elara Ashworth, he had found something he had long thought lost, a reason to believe in love again, and for that he would risk everything. The Blackwood Ball, which had begun with such promise for the Baroness Ashworth, had ended in a maelstrom of barely concealed fury. To see Elara, the girl she had spent a decade molding into a creature of silent obedience, not only present at the most exclusive event of the season, but captivating the attention of the Duke of Blackwood himself, was a humiliation of the highest order. The ride back to Ashworth Manor was a study in glacial silence, the air in the carriage thick with unspoken rage. The moment the carriage door closed behind them, the storm broke. "How dare you?" the Baroness hissed, her voice a low, venomous whisper that was far more terrifying than any shout. "How did you get there? What trickery did you employ to deceive your way into that ballroom?" Elara, who had spent the carriage ride steeling herself for this confrontation, met her stepmother's gaze with a newfound resolve. "I was invited," she stated simply, her voice calm and even. This was a lie, of course, but a necessary one. She had, in fact, used a forgotten service entrance in the cover of darkness, her midnight blue gown, a relic of her mother's, her only disguise. "Invited?" the Baroness scoffed, her laughter a harsh, grating sound. "Do not play me for a fool, you insolent girl. You are nothing, a ghost in this house. Who would invite you?" "Perhaps someone who sees more in me than you do," Elara countered, the words tasting of a delicious, long-denied rebellion. The Baroness's eyes narrowed to slits. "The Duke," she breathed, the name a curse on her lips. You have somehow managed to ensnare him with your pathetic, wide-eyed innocence. But do not think for a moment that this changes anything. You are and always will be a nobody, a stain on this family's name. The words which once would have pierced Alara's heart like daggers now seemed to glance off an invisible shield. The knowledge she now possessed, the truth of her parentage, had forged a new strength within her. She was not a stain on the Ashworth name. She was a living, breathing testament to the Baroness's own hypocrisy. The following days were a battle of wills. The Baroness, determined to reassert her dominance, confined Alara to her room, forbidding her from leaving the house. But the Duke of Blackwood was not a man to be so easily deterred. A veritable flood of flowers, books, and invitations began to arrive at Ashworth Manor, all addressed to Miss Alara Ashworth. The Baroness, in a fit of pique, had them all burned. But the Duke was as resourceful as he was relentless. One afternoon, as Alara sat by her window, a small paper-wrapped parcel landed on the sill, delivered by a well-aimed stone. Inside was a note written in the Duke's strong, elegant hand. "My dearest Miss Ashworth," it began, "I find myself in a state of profound and rather ungentlemanly impatience. Your absence from society has created a void that no amount of insipid conversation or lukewarm champagne can fill. I must see you again. There is a small, secluded garden at the back of the British Museum. Meet me there tomorrow at noon. Yours in hopeful anticipation, Blackwood." Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. It was a risk, a terrible risk. But the thought of seeing him again, of escaping, even for a few hours, the oppressive atmosphere of Ashworth Manor, was too tempting to resist. The next day, with the help of Mrs. Gable, who had become a silent but steadfast ally, Alara slipped out of the house, her face hidden by a simple bonnet and veil. The garden was just as the Duke had described it, a hidden oasis of green in the heart of the bustling city. And he was there, waiting for her, a single white camellia in his hand. "I was beginning to fear you would not come," he said, his voice a low, intimate murmur that sent a shiver down her spine. "And I was beginning to fear you had given up," she replied, a small smile playing on her lips. They spent the afternoon talking, their conversation flowing as easily as the water in the nearby fountain. He spoke of his travels, of the exotic lands he had seen, the fascinating people he had met, and she, in turn, spoke of her love for books, for art, for the world that existed beyond the four walls of Ashworth Manor. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the garden, the conversation took a more serious turn. "Alara," he said, his voice laced with a gentle concern, "I know that your stepmother is not a kind woman. I have heard the whispers, seen the way she looks at you. You do not have to endure it. I can help you." Alara, who had spent her entire life feeling powerless, was suddenly faced with a choice. She could accept his help, allow him to be her knight in shining armor, or she could fight her own battles, reclaim her own life. "I appreciate your offer, Your Grace," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "But this is a battle I must fight on my own. There are things you do not know, secrets that must be brought to light." Alistair, though disappointed, could not help but admire her strength, her fierce independence. "Then at least allow me to be your ally," he said, his hand covering hers. "Whatever you need, whatever you require, you have but to ask." And as she looked into his eyes, she saw not pity, but a deep and abiding respect. And in that moment, she knew that she was not alone. She had a powerful ally in the Duke of Blackwood, and together they would unravel the web of deceit that the Baroness had so carefully woven. Their clandestine meetings continued, their bond deepening with each stolen moment. But the Baroness was not a woman to be underestimated. She had spies everywhere, and it was only a matter of time before she discovered their secret. The confrontation came sooner than Alara had anticipated. She returned from one of her meetings with the Duke to find the Baroness waiting for her in the library, a letter in her hand. It was from Alistair, a passionate declaration of his feelings for Alara, a plea for her to leave Ashworth Manor and be with him. "So," the Baroness said, her voice dripping with a venomous sweetness, "the little mouse has found a protector, a very powerful protector, I must admit. But do you really think he will still want you when he learns the truth? When he learns that you are not the daughter of a baron, but the bastard child of a woman of no consequence?" Alara's blood ran cold. How could she know? The journal, the letter, they were her secrets. Unless, You knew, Alara whispered, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place with a sickening thud. You knew all along. Of course I knew, the Baroness said, a triumphant smile spreading across her face. I am not a fool. Your father, in his sentimental dotage, made provisions for you, left you a small inheritance. But I, as your legal guardian, have been managing it for you. And I have been very, very careful with it. The full extent of the Baroness's cruelty was laid bare. She had not only robbed Alara of her name, her identity, her inheritance, but she had done so with a cold, calculated precision that was truly monstrous. You will not win, Alara said, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and grief. The truth will come out, and the Duke, he will not abandon me. We shall see, the Baroness said, her eyes glinting with a malicious light. We shall see. And as Alara stood in the dimly lit library, the weight of the Baroness's words pressing down on her, she knew that the battle for her future had just begun. And it would be a battle fought not with swords and pistols, but with secrets and lies. A battle for the very soul of the man she had come to love. The Baroness Ashworth, armed with what she believed to be an unassailable weapon, moved with the swift and deadly precision of a striking cobra. She would not allow her meticulously constructed world to be brought down by a sentimental girl and her lovesick Duke. Her first move was to sow the seeds of doubt in the fertile ground of London society. She began with the Dowager Duchess of Blackwood, a woman whose pride in her ancient and unblemished lineage was legendary. The Baroness requested a private audience, arriving at the Duchess's townhouse cloaked in an artfully crafted performance of maternal concern. Your Grace, as she began, her voice trembling with feigned emotion, dabbing at her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. It is with the heaviest of hearts that I must speak to you of a most delicate matter. It concerns my stepdaughter, Alara, and your son, the Duke. The Dowager Duchess, a formidable woman with eyes as sharp as her wit, regarded the Baroness with a cool, appraising gaze. Do proceed, Baroness. I am listening. Alara, the Baroness continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, is a troubled girl. She has always been imaginative, prone to flights of fancy, and I fear that her infatuation with the Duke has led her to create a most unfortunate and damaging fantasy. She then proceeded to paint a picture of Alara as a mentally unstable and manipulative young woman, a fortune hunter who had concocted a wild and unbelievable story about her parentage in order to ensnare the Duke. She hinted at a history of instability, of a fragile mind that had been shattered by the early death of her mother. The Dowager Duchess, though a woman of the world and not easily swayed by gossip, was, above all, a mother. The thought of her son, her only child, being trapped in a marriage with a woman of questionable sanity and even more questionable motives, was a prospect she could not abide. The Baroness's poison, so skillfully administered, began to take effect. The Dowager Duchess, though she did not forbid Alistair from seeing Alara, began to express her concerns, her gentle but persistent questions planting seeds of doubt in his mind. Alistair, though his love for Alara was strong, was not immune to his mother's influence. He had always trusted her judgment, her uncanny ability to see through the false fronts and polished veneers of London society. And so, a small, insidious worm of doubt began to wriggle its way into his heart. He began to question Alara, his inquiries veiled in a clumsy attempt at subtlety. Tell me more about your childhood, Alara, he would say, about your mother. Alara, unaware of the Baroness's machinations, answered his questions with an open and honest heart. Her stories of her mother, gleaned from her father's journal, filled with a poignant and heartfelt longing. But to Alistair, his mind now tainted by his mother's fears, her stories sounded rehearsed. Her emotions, though genuine, seemed overwrought. The Baroness, sensing a shift in the wind, pressed her advantage. She began to drop hints to her society friends, her words carefully chosen to create an aura of scandal and intrigue around Alara. Whispers began to circulate, rumors of a mysterious illness, of a dark secret in the Ashworth family, of a young woman who was not what she seemed. Alara, once a phantom in the background of society, now found herself the subject of intense and unwelcome scrutiny. At a garden party, she overheard two ladies whispering behind their fans, their words like the sting of a wasp. They say she is not right in the head, one of them murmured. that the baroness has had to keep her hidden away for years. And the Duke, the other replied, her voice filled with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. They say he is utterly besotted with her. A classic case of a man being blinded by a pretty face and a tragic story. The words cut Ilara to the quick. She had fought so hard to escape the shadows, only to find herself trapped in a new and even more insidious prison. The prison of public opinion. The final and most devastating blow came in the form of a letter from Alistair. It was a carefully worded and agonizingly polite missive, but the message was clear. He was pulling away. "My dearest Ilara," it read, "recent events have given me cause for reflection. I believe it would be prudent for us to take some time apart, to allow the whispers and rumors to die down. I trust you will understand." Understand? How could she understand? He had promised to be her ally, her protector. And now at the first sign of trouble, he was abandoning her. The baroness, who had intercepted the letter and presented it to Ilara with a triumphant smirk, twisted the knife with a cruel and practiced skill. "You see, my dear," she said, her voice a purr of satisfaction, "I told you he would not want you. Men like the Duke do not marry damaged goods. They do not marry nobodies." In that moment, Ilara felt a despair so profound that it threatened to swallow her whole. The one person she had thought she could trust, the one person who had made her believe in the possibility of love and happiness, had turned his back on her. The baroness had won. Or so it seemed. But in the depths of her despair, a new and unfamiliar feeling began to take root in Ilara's heart. It was not anger, not grief, but a cold, hard resolve. She would not be broken. She would not be defeated. She would fight back. She still had one card left to play. Her father's solicitor, Mr. Alistair Finch. He was the key, the one person who could corroborate her story, who could provide the proof she needed to expose the baroness for the monster she was. With a renewed sense of purpose, Ilara began to formulate a plan. She would not be a damsel in distress, waiting for a prince to rescue her. She would be the heroine of her own story, and she would bring the Baroness Ashworth to her knees. The unraveling of a lady was about to begin, but it would not be Ilara who would be undone. It would be the Baroness herself. The opulent drawing rooms of London, once a distant and unattainable dream for Ilara, now felt like a gilded cage, each whisper a bar, each sidelong glance a lock. The Baroness's campaign of whispers had been brutally effective. Ilara, the mysterious Miss Ashworth, who had briefly captured the Duke's attention, was now regarded as an object of pity and suspicion. The invitations that had once flooded Ashworth Manor had dwindled to a trickle, then stopped altogether. But Ilara was not idle in her isolation. The Duke's withdrawal, as painful as it was, had served to sharpen her focus, to hone her resolve into a fine, sharp point. She would not be defined by the man she loved, nor by the woman she despised. She would be defined by the truth. And the truth she knew lay with Mr. Alistair Finch. The challenge was how to reach him. The Baroness, ever watchful, had tightened her grip, turning Ashworth Manor into a veritable fortress. Ilara was a prisoner, her every move monitored. But the Baroness had made one critical miscalculation. She had underestimated the loyalty of her staff, the very people she treated with such disdain. Mrs. Gable, the kindly seamstress, had long been a silent observer of the Baroness's cruelty and Ilara's quiet suffering. She, more than anyone, knew the truth of Ilara's gentle nature and the Baroness's venomous heart. It was she who became Ilara's lifeline to the outside world. "Mr. Finch, you say?" Mrs. Gable whispered, her hands never ceasing their mending of a lace collar. "I remember him. A good man, a true friend to your father. I must get a message to him, Mrs. Gable," Ilara pleaded, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "It is a matter of life and death." And so, a clandestine correspondence began, a series of notes smuggled out of the manor in Mrs. Gable's sewing basket, carried across the city by a network of sympathetic servants, a footman here, a chambermaid there, all united by their shared disdain for their tyrannical mistress. Mr. Finch's reply, when it finally came, was a beacon of hope in the encroaching darkness. He remembered Ilara, remembered his promise to her father. He had been waiting for her to contact him, had been watching from afar, his hands tied by the legal constraints of his profession. But now, with Alara's plea for help, he was free to act. He confirmed everything. The secret of Alara's parentage, the baroness's deception, the inheritance that had been stolen from her. It was all there in a series of legal documents, sworn affidavits, and a final damning letter from Alara's father, to be opened only by Alara herself or upon the baroness's death. But there was a complication. The baroness, as Alara's legal guardian, had control of the estate, of the inheritance. To challenge her in court would be a long, arduous, and very public process, a scandal that would drag Alara's name and the name of the man she loved through the mud. There was, however, another way, a loophole, a desperate gamble. The inheritance was to be transferred to Alara upon her marriage. If she were to marry, the baroness's guardianship would be terminated, her control over the estate severed. Marriage. The word hung in the air between them, a tantalizing and terrifying possibility. To marry for love was a dream she had long since abandoned. To marry for convenience, for survival, it was a bitter pill to swallow. But what other choice did she have? To remain under the baroness's thumb, a prisoner in her own home, was a fate worse than death. To fight a public battle that would ruin her reputation and tarnish the name of the man she still, despite everything, loved, was unthinkable. And so, with a heavy heart, she made her decision. She would marry, but who? Who would be willing to enter into such a complicated and potentially scandalous arrangement? The answer came to her in a flash of inspiration, a memory of a conversation at the Blackwood Ball, of a man who had spoken of his own financial troubles with a refreshing and rather charming honesty. Lord Harrington, the foppish but good-natured lord who had been so smitten with her on the night she had met the Duke. He was a man of impeccable lineage but dwindling finances, a man in desperate need of a wealthy wife. It was a perfect, if unconventional, solution. A marriage of convenience, a business arrangement that would benefit them both. With Mrs. Gable's help, a meeting was arranged. Lord Harrington, though initially taken aback by the audacity of her proposal, was after careful consideration intrigued. The prospect of a marriage to a beautiful and intelligent woman, a marriage that would solve his financial woes and free her from her gilded cage, was an offer he could not refuse. The news of their engagement, when it was announced, sent shockwaves through London society. The baroness was apoplectic, her carefully laid plans crumbling to dust before her very eyes. She had sought to isolate Alara, to make her a pariah. Instead, she had driven her into the arms of a man who, though not a duke, was still a respectable and well-connected member of the aristocracy. But it was the Duke of Blackwood's reaction that Alara awaited with a mixture of dread and anticipation. She had not seen him since their parting, had not heard a word from him, but she knew that the news of her engagement would reach him, and she wondered, with a painful ache in her heart, if he would even care. The answer came in the form of a single perfect white camellia, delivered to her by a silent and stone-faced footman. There was no note, no card, but there didn't need to be. It was a message, a symbol of what they had shared, a silent testament to a love that, for a brief and shining moment, had seemed possible. And as she held the delicate flower in her hand, its petals as soft as a lover's whisper, Alara allowed herself a single, solitary tear. It was a tear for the love she had lost, for the future that might have been. But it was also a tear of resolve. She had made her choice. She had taken her gamble, and now she would see it through to the end. The wedding was set. The stage was prepared. And the final act of this twisted drama was about to begin. The wedding of Alara Ashworth and Lord Harrington was to be the social event of the season, albeit for all the wrong reasons. The whispers that had once followed Alara had now reached a fever pitch, a cacophony of speculation and gossip. Why would a woman who had once been on the arm of the Duke of Blackwood settle for a man of Lord Harrington's modest means and even more modest reputation? The baroness, though outwardly playing the part of the doting stepmother, was a whirlwind of fury and frustration. She had been outmaneuvered, outplayed. But she was not a woman to admit defeat. She would find a way to turn this situation to her advantage, to salvage her reputation and her position in society. Her opportunity came in the form of a pre-nuptial meeting with the solicitors, a dry and dusty affair that was to be the final nail in the coffin of her guardianship. It was here, in the hallowed halls of Lincoln's Inn Fields, that she planned to play her final, desperate card. The meeting was a tense and formal affair. Ilara, elegant and composed in a gown of pale lavender, sat beside Lord Harrington, who looked rather overwhelmed by the gravity of the situation. On the other side of the polished mahogany table sat the baroness, a study in righteous indignation, her own solicitor, a man with a face like a wizened ferret by her side. And then there was Mr. Finch, a calm and steady presence in the midst of the brewing storm. He began the proceedings with a quiet and methodical reading of the late Baron Ashworth's will, his voice a steady drone that did little to soothe the frayed nerves in the room. When he reached the clause detailing Ilara's inheritance, the baroness interrupted, her voice sharp and accusatory. "An inheritance," she said, her gaze fixed on Ilara, "that she has secured through deception and trickery. This marriage is a sham, a desperate attempt to lay her hands on a fortune she does not deserve." Mr. Finch, without so much as a glance in her direction, continued to read. He spoke of the provisions for Ilara's guardianship, of the baroness's control over the estate until Ilara's marriage. "A control," the baroness interjected, her voice rising with each word, "that I have exercised with the utmost care and diligence. I have protected this girl, sheltered her from the world, from her own fragile sensibilities. And then," Mr. Finch played his trump card, "and then there is the matter of the second letter," he said, his voice calm and even. He produced a sealed envelope from his leather satchel, the wax bearing the unmistakable imprint of the late Baron Ashworth's signet ring. "A letter," he continued, "to be opened only in the event of a dispute regarding Miss Ashworth's parentage." The baroness's face, which had been a mask of righteous fury, paled to a sickly shade of gray. "This is outrageous," she stammered, her composure beginning to crack. "I will not stand for these baseless accusations." But it was too late. The seed of doubt had been planted. Lord Harrington, who had been a silent and rather bewildered spectator, now looked at his future mother-in-law with a new and dawning suspicion. Mr. Finch broke the seal and began to read. The letter was a confession, a final, desperate plea from a dying man to protect his daughter from the woman he had so foolishly trusted. It detailed the baroness's deception, her secret past, the illegitimate child she had abandoned. And then came the final, devastating blow. The Baron had not been a fool. He had made his own inquiries, had hired his own investigators. He had discovered the truth of the Baroness's first husband's death, the suspicious circumstances, the rumors of poison, the fortune she had inherited. The room was silent, save for the sound of the Baroness's ragged breathing. Her carefully constructed world, her web of lies and deceit, had been torn asunder. She was exposed, unmasked, her true and monstrous nature laid bare for all to see. She rose from her chair, her eyes wild and desperate. "Lies!" she shrieked, her voice a shrill and desperate cry. "All lies! This is a conspiracy, a pathetic attempt to ruin me." But no one was listening. Her solicitor, his face a mask of professional horror, was already backing away, distancing himself from the scandal that was about to erupt. Lord Harrington, his face a mixture of shock and disgust, had risen to his feet and moved to stand by Ilara's side, a silent and steadfast gesture of support. And as the Baroness stood there, a woman stripped of her power, her secrets, her dignity, the door to the solicitor's office opened, and in the doorway stood the Duke of Blackwood, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. He had come not to stop the wedding, not to reclaim the woman he loved, but to witness the downfall of the woman who had caused them both so much pain. He had received a message from Mr. Finch, a discreet and urgent summons, and he had come to see justice served. His gaze met Ilara's across the room, and in that silent exchange 1,000 words were spoken. Regret, forgiveness, and a love that, despite everything, had refused to die. The Baroness, seeing the Duke, her final and most coveted prize now forever out of her reach, let out a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a scream. And then, with a final, desperate glance at the faces that surrounded her, the faces of the people whose lives she had so carelessly destroyed, She turned and fled, a woman running from the ruins of her own making. The unmasking was complete. The reign of the Baroness Ashworth was over. And for Alara, a new and uncertain future was about to begin. The implosion of the Baroness Ashworth was as swift as it was spectacular. The revelations from the solicitor's office spread through London like wildfire, fueled by the city's insatiable appetite for scandal. The story had everything: a secret love child, a suspicious death, a stolen inheritance, and the downfall of a woman who had clawed her way to the pinnacle of society, only to be brought crashing down by the very secrets she had fought so hard to conceal. The Baroness, now a social pariah, fled to the continent, her name a byword for deceit and treachery. Clara, her beautiful but vapid daughter, found herself equally ostracized, her prospects for a brilliant match dissolving like sugar in the rain. She was left to the mercies of distant relatives, her future as bleak as the one her mother had so carefully orchestrated for Alara. Ashworth Manor, once a symbol of oppression and despair for Alara, was now hers. The inheritance, so long denied to her, was now at her disposal. She was no longer a shadow, a ghost in her own home. She was the mistress of her own destiny. But the victory, as sweet as it was not without its complications. There was the small matter of her engagement to Lord Harrington. The marriage, a desperate gamble born of necessity, was no longer necessary. It was Lord Harrington himself who, with a grace and charm that Alara had not previously given him credit for, addressed the issue. "My dear Alara," he said, taking her hand as they sat in the now bright and airy drawing room of Ashworth Manor. "It would seem that our arrangement is no longer required. You are a free woman, a woman of means. You have no need of a husband of convenience." "But I made you a promise, my lord," Alara replied, a genuine affection for this kind and honorable man welling up inside her. "And I release you from it," he said, a gentle smile playing on his lips. "To hold you to a promise made under duress would be ungentlemanly. And besides," he added, a mischievous twinkle in his eye, "I do not think my heart could bear the competition." He was, of course, referring to the Duke of Blackwood. Alistair had been a constant, if distant, presence in the days following the Baroness's downfall. He had not called on her, had not sent any more mysterious camellias. He was giving her space, allowing her the time and freedom to navigate the treacherous waters of her new life. But his presence was felt nonetheless. He had used his influence to quell the more salacious rumors, to ensure that Alara's name was cleared, her reputation restored. He had, in his own quiet and unassuming way, been her protector, her champion. And now, with the matter of her engagement to Lord Harrington resolved, the path was clear. But it was a path that Alara was not yet sure she was ready to take. She had spent so long fighting for her freedom, for her identity. To step so quickly into a new life, a new role, as the Duchess of Blackwood, it was a daunting prospect. She needed time to heal, time to discover who she was, not as the downtrodden stepdaughter, not as the mysterious Miss Ashworth, but as Alara. Just Alara. She threw herself into the task of transforming Ashworth Manor, of banishing the ghosts of the past and creating a home filled with light and laughter. She reconnected with Mr. Finch, who became a trusted friend and advisor. She sought out Mrs. Gable, showering her with a generosity that brought tears to the old woman's eyes. She began to host small, intimate gatherings, her guests not the fickle and gossiping members of the ton, but artists, writers, and thinkers, people who were drawn to her intelligence, her wit, and her quiet strength. And through it all, she was aware of the Duke, watching from the wings, his patience a testament to the depth of his feelings for her. He would occasionally appear at her gatherings, his presence a quiet and reassuring one. They would talk, their conversations easy and familiar, their connection as strong as ever. But he never pressed her, never pushed her for a commitment. He was waiting for her to come to him, to be ready to choose him, not out of necessity, not out of gratitude, but out of love. And as the seasons turned, as the gray London winter gave way to the first, tentative blooms of spring, Alara found herself thinking more and more of the Duke. She missed him. She missed their conversations, their shared laughter, the way he looked at her as if she were the only woman in the world. She realized that her freedom, the freedom she had fought so hard to win, would not be diminished by sharing her life with him. It would be enhanced. He was not a man who would seek to control her, to possess her. He was a man who would stand beside her, who would be her partner, her equal. And so one sunny afternoon, as she sat in the garden of Ashworth Manor, a garden she had brought back to life with her own 2 hands, she sent a note to the Duke of Blackwood. It was a simple note, just a few words. "My dearest Alistair," it read, "the camellias are in bloom. I think it is time we had a talk." She knew that he would come, and she knew that when he did, she would be ready, ready to leave the past behind, ready to embrace the future, ready to finally and completely give her heart to the man who had seen the fire within her, even when she had thought it had been extinguished forever. Alistair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood, received Alara's note with a sense of profound relief that was so overwhelming it almost brought him to his knees. He had been living in a state of self-imposed exile, a purgatory of his own making. He had been a fool, a coward. He had allowed the whispers of others, the fears of his mother, to cloud his judgment, to make him doubt the one woman who had ever managed to break through the cynical shell he had built around his heart. He had watched from afar as she had navigated the treacherous aftermath of her stepmother's downfall, his admiration for her growing with each passing day. She was not a fragile flower in need of his protection. She was a warrior, a woman of incredible strength and resilience. And he loved her for it. He had given her the space she needed, had respected her silent request for time. But his patience had been wearing thin, his fear that he had lost her forever, a constant and gnawing presence in his gut. Her note, so simple and yet so full of promise, was a balm to his tormented soul. He found her in the garden, just as she had said he would. The camellias were indeed in bloom, their delicate white and pink blossoms a stark and beautiful contrast to the ancient stone walls of Ashworth Manor. She was standing by a sundial, her back to him, her simple white gown a beacon in the afternoon sun. He approached her slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Ilara," he said, his voice a low, hesitant whisper. She turned, and the smile that lit up her face was so radiant, so full of a genuine and unadulterated joy, that it took his breath away. "Alistair," she said, her voice a soft and welcoming melody, "I was beginning to think you had forgotten the way." "Never," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer contain. "I have thought of little else." They stood in a comfortable silence for a moment, the unspoken words hanging in the air between them, a tangible and powerful force. It was Ilara who spoke first, her gaze direct and unwavering. "I have missed you," she said simply. "And you," he replied, his voice cracking with the weight of his regret. "More than you can possibly imagine. Ilara, I am so sorry. For my doubts, for my weakness. I should have trusted you, should have stood by you. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to you, if you will let me." "There is nothing to forgive," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "We were both victims of a cruel and manipulative woman, but she is gone now, and we are free." Free. The word echoed in the space between them, a promise of a future that was theirs for the taking. He took a step closer, his hand reaching out to cup her face, his thumb gently stroking her cheek. "I love you, Ilara," he said, his voice a raw and honest confession. "I have loved you since the moment I saw you standing in that ballroom, a solitary star in a sea of glittering but empty constellations. I love your mind, your strength, your spirit. I love everything about you." Tears welled up in Ilara's eyes, tears not of sadness, but of a joy so profound that it filled her to the very brim of her being. "And I love you, Alistair," she whispered, her hand covering his. "I love the man who saw past the shadows, who saw the fire within me, the man who waited." And then he kissed her, a kiss that was both a question and an answer, a promise and a prayer. It was a kiss that spoke of regret and forgiveness, of a love that had been tested and had emerged, not unscathed, but stronger, deeper, and more resilient than before. In the days and weeks that followed, they were inseparable, their love a quiet and beautiful thing that blossomed in the secluded gardens of Ashworth Manor. They talked for hours, sharing their hopes, their dreams, their fears. They discovered that they were two halves of a whole, two souls that had been searching for each other in a world that had tried to keep them apart. The Dowager Duchess, who had been instrumental in their separation, was now their most ardent supporter. She had been consumed with guilt over her role in the affair, and she welcomed Alara into the family with an open and repentant heart. She saw in Alara not a threat, but a kindred spirit, a woman of intelligence and strength who would be a true partner to her son. The wedding, when it happened, was not a grand and ostentatious affair, not a spectacle for the gossiping masses of London society. It was a small, intimate ceremony held in the garden of Ashworth Manor, surrounded by the people who truly loved them. Mr. Finch, Mrs. Galball, a newly humbled and genuinely happy Lord Harrington, and the Dowager Duchess, her eyes shining with tears of joy. And as Alara stood before the man she loved, her hand in his, a simple band of gold on her finger, she knew that she had finally found her home. Not in the grand and imposing walls of Blackwood Manor, but in the heart of the man who had loved her not for her name, not for her fortune, but for the woman she was and the woman she was yet to become. The shadows of the past had been banished, and before her lay a future that was as bright and as full of promise as the summer sky above them. The transition from Miss Alara Ashworth, the reclaimed heiress, to her Grace, the Duchess of Blackwood, was a journey not of social climbing, but of quiet and profound self-discovery. Alara had never been one for the frivolous and often cruel games of the ton, and she had no intention of changing now. She would not be a duchess in the mold of the women who had once scorned her. She would be a duchess of her own making. Blackwood Manor, a sprawling and magnificent estate that made Ashworth Manor look like a country cottage, was at first an intimidating prospect. It was a house steeped in history, in tradition, a living testament to the power and prestige of the Beaumont family. The portraits of Alistair's ancestors, their stern and judgmental eyes seeming to follow her every move, were a constant reminder of the legacy she had married into. But with Alistair by her side, his love a constant and reassuring presence, she began to find her place. She did not seek to erase the history of the house, but to add her own chapter to it. She filled the grand and often gloomy rooms with light and air, with books and flowers, with the sound of music and laughter. She took a genuine interest in the estate and its tenants. Her conversations with the farmers and villagers, not the condescending inquiries of a distant aristocrat, but the genuine and compassionate questions of a woman who understood, on a deeply personal level, the struggles of those less fortunate. She established a school for the children of the estate, a lending library for the adults. She used her inheritance not for frivolous luxuries, but to improve the lives of the people who now depended on her. And in doing so, she earned not just their respect, but their love. Alistair watched her, his heart filled with a love and admiration that grew with each passing day. He had always known she was extraordinary, but he had never imagined the depth of her compassion, the breadth of her vision. She was not just his wife, his duchess. She was his partner, his equal, his inspiration. Their love, which had been forged in the crucible of scandal and deceit, now settled into a comfortable and deeply satisfying rhythm. They were a team, a united front against the often stifling expectations of their class. They hosted gatherings, not the stuffy and formal affairs that were the norm, but lively and engaging salons where artists, writers, and thinkers from all walks of life could come together to debate and discuss the issues of the day. Alara, once a silent and invisible girl, had found her voice, and it was a voice that people wanted to hear. She was not just the Duchess of Blackwood. She was a patron of the arts, a champion of social reform, a woman who was using her position and her fortune to make a difference in the world. But their life was not all serious-minded philanthropy. There were moments of quiet intimacy, of shared laughter, of a love that was as passionate as it was profound. They would spend hours in the library, reading to each other, or walking hand in hand through the magnificent gardens of Blackwood Manor. It was during one of these walks that Alara shared with Alistair a secret she had been holding close to her heart, a secret that would change their lives forever. "Alistair," she said, her voice a soft and hesitant whisper, "there is something I must tell you." He stopped, his brow furrowed with a gentle concern. "What is it, my love?" She took his hand and placed it on her stomach. "We are to have a child," she said, her eyes shining with a joy that was so pure and so profound that it took his breath away. He stared at her for a moment, his mind struggling to comprehend the magnitude of her words. A child, a son or a daughter, a new life, a new beginning, a symbol of their love, a testament to their future. He swept her up in his arms, his laughter a joyous and uninhibited sound that echoed through the gardens. A child, he repeated, his voice thick with an emotion that was too powerful for words. Oh, Elara, my love, you have made me the happiest of men. And as he held her there, in the heart of the garden, surrounded by the beauty of the life they had created together, he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that he had found his happily ever after. It was not a fairy tale ending, not a life free from challenges or sorrows, but it was a real life, a life filled with love, with purpose, with a joy that was as deep and as abiding as the roots of the ancient oaks that stood sentinel over their home. The boy who had been the most desired duke in England had found his heart's desire, not in a ballroom, not in a society debutante, but in a woman who had been raised to believe she was nothing, a woman who had, against all odds, become his everything. Years passed, the seasons turning in their reliable and comforting rhythm, each one adding a new layer to the rich and beautiful tapestry of Elara and Alistair's life together. The birth of their first child, a son with his father's dark hair and his mother's intelligent gray eyes, was followed by the birth of a daughter, a spirited and independent girl who was the apple of her father's eye. Blackwood Manor, once a silent and imposing monument to a storied past, was now a home, a place filled with the sounds of children's laughter, the warmth of a loving family. The ghosts of the past had been banished, replaced by the vibrant and joyful energy of a new generation. Elara, the Duchess of Blackwood, had become a legend in her own right. She was not just a society hostess, but a force for change, a woman whose name was synonymous with compassion, with intelligence, with a quiet and unshakable strength. She had used her position, her fortune, and her voice to champion the causes she believed in, to create a legacy that would endure long after she was gone. Alistair, by her side, had found a sense of purpose and fulfillment that he had never thought possible. He was no longer the brooding and cynical duke of his youth, but a man who had been transformed by the love of a good woman. He was a devoted husband, a doting father, a respected and beloved leader of his community. They had faced their share of challenges, of course. Life was not a fairy tale, and even a duke and a duchess were not immune to the sorrows and struggles that were a part of the human experience. But they had faced them together, their love a constant and unwavering anchor in the often turbulent seas of life. One summer evening, as they sat on the terrace overlooking the gardens, the setting sun casting a golden glow over the landscape, Elara found an old, worn wooden bird in the pocket of her dress. It was a replica, a perfect and loving recreation of the one that had been so cruelly destroyed by her stepsister all those years ago. Alistair had had it made for her, a symbol of the past she had overcome, the future she had so bravely claimed. She held it in her hand, the smooth, worn wood a comforting weight in her palm. "Do you ever think of her?" she asked, her voice a soft and contemplative whisper. Alistair knew who she meant, the baroness. They had heard whispers of her over the years, stories of a lonely and bitter old woman living out her days in a faded and forgotten corner of the continent, her beauty and her fortune long since gone. "Sometimes," he replied, his arm wrapping around her shoulders, "but I do not think of her with anger or with hatred. I think of her with a strange and rather sad sense of pity. She had so much, and yet she had nothing." Elara leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart filled with a sense of peace that was as deep and as profound as the summer twilight. "She gave me one thing," she said, a small smile playing on her lips. "And what is that?" he asked, his voice a low and loving murmur. "She gave me you," she whispered, and in that simple and heartfelt declaration lay the truth of their story. It was not a story of revenge, but of redemption. Not a story of bitterness, but of forgiveness. It was a story of a love that had been born in the shadows, that had been tested by the fires of deceit and betrayal, and that had emerged not just intact, but stronger, more beautiful, and more enduring than they could have ever imagined. It was a legacy of love, a legacy that would be passed down through the generations, a story that would be told and retold, a reminder that even in the darkest of nights, there is always the promise of a new day, a new beginning, a new and everlasting love. And as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the Duke and his Duchess sat in a comfortable and contented silence, their hearts full, their love a beacon that would shine for all time. And so, our story of Elara, the woman raised to believe she was nothing, and the Duke who saw everything in her, comes to a close. Theirs is a tale that reminds us that our circumstances do not have to define us, that the cruelty of others cannot extinguish the fire that burns within our own souls. It is a testament to the power of resilience, the strength of the human spirit, and the enduring magic of a love that sees beyond the surface to the true beauty that lies within. We've journeyed through the shadowed manors of Regency London, navigated a web of secrets and lies, and witnessed a love that conquered all. If this story of triumph and romance has captured your heart, please don't let the journey end here. Show your love by clicking that like button, share this tale with fellow romantics, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that will sweep you off your feet. Your support allows us to continue bringing these timeless tales to life. Thank you for listening.